Twilight settles over an affluent suburb where a woman in a faded hoodie is watering her hydrangeas. Moments later, a patrol cruiser slows to a halt. Within minutes, she will be slammed against the hood of a police car and handcuffed. The officer believes he has just nabbed a burglar casing a wealthy neighborhood. What he does not know is that he has just placed steel bracelets on the Honorable Judge Elena Whitaker, a federal district judge. This is the mistake that shattered a police department. The gavel had come down, concluding a grueling antitrust trial that had drained every ounce of energy from Judge Elena Whitaker. At 54, Elena was a force of nature within the United States District Court. She was known for her razor-sharp intellect, her zero-tolerance policy for courtroom theatrics, and a meticulous interpretation of the law that commanded respect from both seasoned prosecutors and high-priced defense attorneys. But outside the mahogany-paneled courtroom, Elena was simply a woman who cherished the quiet solitude of her home. Her sanctuary was located in an exclusive, heavily manicured enclave of sprawling estates and ancient oak trees. It was the kind of neighborhood where private landscaping trucks outnumbered residents during the day, and the silence of the evening was broken only by the hum of high-end European sedans pulling into long, sweeping driveways. Elena had purchased her four-bedroom colonial years earlier, a tangible reward for decades of relentless work. Late nights buried in legal precedents and the sheer grit required to rise through the ranks as a black woman in a fiercely competitive judicial system. On a crisp evening in autumn, the air was sharp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Elena had shed her tailored charcoal suit and the heavy black robe the moment she walked through her front door. She had swapped the armor of her profession for comfort, a pair of worn-out gray sweatpants, a faded navy blue college hoodie, and old running shoes. She had tied her thick dark hair back into a loose, messy bun. Stripped of her judicial regalia, she looked like anyone else, trying to unwind after a long day. She remembered she had left 2 heavy boxes of legal files in the trunk of her Mercedes, which was parked at the far end of her wraparound driveway. The files were sealed transcripts she needed to review over the weekend. Groaning softly, she grabbed her keys and stepped out into the crisp evening air. Nearby, Officer Harlan Tate was gripping the steering wheel of his patrol cruiser with white-knuckled tension. Harlan was a man with a tight buzz cut, a square jaw, and many years on the force. A tenure marked by a trail of excessive force complaints that had miraculously never stuck. For his early years on the job, Harlan had worked the gritty downtown sectors where his proactive and aggressive style of policing was quietly overlooked by his superiors. However, after a particularly ugly incident involving a rough arrest that resulted in a civil settlement, the department brass had decided to quietly transfer him to the affluent suburb precinct. The wealthy neighborhood was supposed to be a cooling-off assignment, a place where Harlan could write parking tickets, respond to noise complaints, and occasionally rescue a cat. Instead, Harlan hated it. He felt neutered. He despised the wealthy residents who looked through him, and he roamed the quiet tree-lined streets with a chip on his shoulder, desperately looking for real police work in a place where crime was virtually non-existent. Harlan turned his cruiser onto the main artery of Elena's neighborhood. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting long amber shadows across the immaculate lawns. He was driving at a crawl, his eyes scanning the properties with the ingrained suspicion of a man who believed trouble was always hiding just out of sight. As he rolled past the high wrought-iron gates of Elena's property, something caught his eye. A figure in a baggy hoodie and sweatpants was standing at the open trunk of a luxury sedan, wrestling with a heavy cardboard box. In the fading light, Harlan could not make out the details of the face, but he saw the dark skin, the casual, almost sloppy attire, and the high-end vehicle. In Harlan's mind, the variables immediately snapped into a rigid, prejudiced equation. The neighborhood was predominantly white. The residents wore designer athleisure, even when they were just checking the mail. They did not wear ratty hoodies, and they certainly did not look over their shoulders while unloading boxes from a luxury car at twilight. Harlan tapped his brakes. The cruiser's tires crunched softly against the asphalt. He did not see a federal judge retrieving her work. He saw a suspect. He saw a crime in progress. He saw an opportunity to finally do some real police work. Without calling it into dispatch, Harlan killed the headlights of his cruiser and pulled the vehicle silently up to the edge of Elena's driveway, blocking the exit. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder, hesitated, and then let it drop back against his chest. He did not need backup for this. He stepped out of the vehicle, resting his right hand heavily on the butt of his service weapon, his boots heavy against the concrete as he began the long walk up the driveway. Elena finally managed to get a solid grip on the bottom of the heavy cardboard box. It was loaded with hundreds of pages of deposition transcripts. She hefted it against her chest, letting out a sharp breath, and turned to walk toward the side entrance of her garage. "Hey, put the box down and step away from the vehicle." The voice cut through the quiet evening like a whip. It was loud, authoritative, and laced with an unmistakable edge of hostility. Elena startled, nearly dropping the box. She turned to see a police officer, walking briskly up her driveway, his posture rigid, one hand hovering dangerously close to his holster. The flashing red and blue lights were off, but the silhouette of the cruiser blocking her driveway was unmistakable. For a fraction of a second, Elena's mind ran through the logical possibilities. A neighborhood emergency, a warning about a prowler, but the aggressive stance and the barked order told a different story. "I said put the box down right now. Hands where I can see them," Harlan commanded, closing the distance between them. He stopped about 10 feet away, positioning himself between Elena and the side door of her home. Elena slowly lowered the box onto the bumper of her car. Her heart gave a singular, heavy thump, but her years on the bench had trained her to maintain absolute composure in the face of aggression. She did not panic. She observed. She noted the officer's name tag, Tate, the tense set of his jaw, and the aggressive widening of his stance. "Officer," Elena said, her voice calm, modulated, and entirely devoid of the fear Harlan was accustomed to hearing. "Can I help you?" "Step away from the car," Harlan snapped, ignoring her question. He pulled his flashlight from his belt, shining the blinding LED beam directly into her eyes, despite the ambient light from the street lamps. "What are you doing here?" Elena narrowed her eyes against the glare, refusing to raise her hands to shield her face. She stood her ground. "I am unloading my vehicle, Officer Tate. Now I would appreciate it if you lowered that light." Harlan did not move the beam. If anything, he stepped closer. The absolute lack of deference in her tone irritated him. Suspects were supposed to be nervous. They were supposed to stammer. This woman was looking at him with the detached, analytical gaze of someone examining an unpleasant insect. "Whose car is this?" Harlan demanded. "Whose house is this?" "This is my car," Elena replied, her voice dropping an octave, settling into the commanding tone that regularly silenced bickering attorneys in her courtroom. "And this is my home. Now, unless there is a specific emergency you need to alert me to, I am going to take my files inside." Harlan let out a short, mocking scoff. "Your home, right? $1.5 million property, and you're out here in a dirty hoodie, digging through the trunk of a luxury car. Let's see some ID." The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the cool autumn air. Elena felt the familiar cold prickle of righteous anger. She knew the law. She knew it intimately. Under the Fourth Amendment, an officer needed reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime had been, was being, or was about to be committed to demand identification. Standing in one's own driveway, unloading one's own car, did not meet that threshold, not even close. "No," Elena said simply. Harlan froze. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I am on my own private property. I am engaged in a lawful activity. You have articulated no reasonable suspicion that I am committing a crime. Therefore, under the law, I am not required to provide you with identification." Harlan's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He was not used to people quoting the law at him. much less people he had already profiled and dismissed in his mind as criminals. To him, her refusal was not an assertion of constitutional rights. It was a challenge to his authority, and Gregory Harlan Tate never backed down from a challenge. "Listen to me very carefully," Harlan said, stepping into her personal space, his chest puffed out, trying to use his height and physical presence to intimidate her. "You are going to give me your ID right now, or I am going to detain you for loitering and suspected burglary." "Loitering on my own property?" Elena raised a single, skeptical eyebrow. The legal absurdity of his threat was almost comical, but the danger of the situation was entirely real. She knew exactly how encounters involving black citizens and aggressive cops could escalate. She kept her hands perfectly still, resting them on the trunk of her car in plain sight. "Officer, I strongly advise you to step back, get in your vehicle and drive away. You are crossing a very dangerous legal line." "Are you threatening me?" Harlan barked, his hand dropping away from his flashlight and resting fully on his handcuffs. "I'm stating a fact," Elena said calmly. "You are trespassing. You are harassing a citizen without probable cause. If you continue this course of action, it will end very poorly for you." She never explicitly told him she was a federal judge. It was a conscious choice. Elena Whitaker despised the idea that her title was the only thing that could protect her from police harassment. Every citizen, regardless of their profession, was entitled to the exact same constitutional protections. If she played the judge card now, he would back down out of fear of her power, not out of respect for the law. She wanted to see exactly how far this officer was willing to go. She got her answer immediately. "All right, that's it. Put your hands behind your back," Harlan snarled. He lunged forward, grabbing Elena's left wrist with a brutal, wrenching grip, twisting it forcefully behind her back. Elena gasped, a sharp jolt of pain shooting up her shoulder. "Officer, you are committing a false arrest and battery. Take your hands off me." "Stop resisting," Harlan yelled, a phrase he reflexively shouted to justify his use of force, despite the fact that Elena was not fighting back. He slammed his body weight against her, pinning her chest aggressively against the cold metal of the Mercedes trunk. Across the street, the porch light of the neighbor's residence flicked on. Elias Boone, a retired professional, stepped out in his slippers, peering through the darkness at the commotion. "Elias, call the police captain!" Elena shouted, her cheek pressed painfully against the trunk of her car. "Shut up," Harlan commanded. He unclipped his handcuffs. The cold steel ratcheted tightly around Elena's left wrist, biting into her skin. He grabbed her right arm, forcing it back to meet the left, and locked the cuffs in place. He yanked up on the chain between her wrists, causing her to wince in pain. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," Elena said, her voice tight with pain, but entirely unbroken in spirit. "Yeah, we'll let the desk sergeant figure that out," Harlan sneered. He grabbed her by the bicep, pulling her away from her car and marching her roughly down her own driveway toward his cruiser. The back of the police cruiser smelled of stale sweat, cheap pine air freshener, and old vinyl. Harlan opened the rear door and shoved Elena inside. Because her hands were cuffed behind her back, she could not brace herself, and she fell awkwardly against the hard plastic seat, her shoulder slamming into the door panel. Harlan slammed the door shut, locking her in the claustrophobic cage. A thick plexiglass partition separated the front and back seats. Harlan climbed into the driver's seat, his breathing heavy, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He felt victorious. He had taken down a defiant suspect. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have one in custody, transporting to the station for booking. Suspected burglary, failure to identify, and resisting." "Copy, Unit 4!" The dispatcher's voice crackled back, completely oblivious to the legal hurricane Harlan had just unleashed. Harlan threw the cruiser into drive, pulling away from Elena's driveway and accelerating down the street. In the rearview mirror, he could see his prisoner, He expected her to be crying. He expected her to be begging, apologizing, offering a dozen different excuses, or finally agreeing to tell him her name. Instead, Elena sat perfectly upright. Despite the awkward and painful position of her arms, she maintained a posture of absolute dignity. Her dark eyes met his in the rearview mirror. They were cold, analytical, and entirely unblinking. "You know you could have made this easy on yourself," Harlan said loudly over the roar of the engine, unable to handle the heavy silence radiating from the back seat. "All you had to do was show an ID, but you people always have to make it difficult, always have to push back. You people." Elena committed the phrase to memory. She cataloged every detail of the interaction. The lack of reasonable suspicion, the failure to de-escalate, the excessive force, the implicit racial bias. She was building a mental dossier, cross-referencing Harlan's actions with decades of civil rights jurisprudence. Section 1983, Terry versus Ohio, Graham versus Connor. The legal precedents flashed through her mind like weapons being loaded into a magazine. "Not talking now, huh?" Harlan taunted, taking a corner a little too fast, causing Elena to slide helplessly against the plastic seat. "Big, tough lawyer type on the driveway. And now you got nothing to say. Don't worry. We'll find out exactly who you are when we run your prints." Elena remained silent. She turned her gaze away from the mirror and looked out the window, watching the familiar streets of her town blur past. She felt a profound sense of sadness beneath her burning anger. She was a federal judge. She wielded immense power, and yet in a faded hoodie, standing in her own driveway, she was entirely vulnerable to the whims of a mediocre man with a badge and a gun. If this could happen to her, what was happening to the kids who did not know their rights? To the people who could not afford top-tier civil rights attorneys? Shortly after, the cruiser pulled into the brightly lit rear parking lot of the police department. Harlan parked near the sally port, got out, and opened the rear door. "Out!" he barked, grabbing her by the arm again and hauling her to her feet. Elena stepped out, her joints aching from the awkward confinement. She stood tall, refusing to slouch, refusing to give Harlan the satisfaction of seeing her physically diminished. He marched her toward the heavy steel doors of the precinct. Inside, the booking area was quiet. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. At the raised wooden desk sat Desk Sergeant Lyle Corbin. Lyle was a veteran of the force, a meticulous, by-the-book officer who was counting down the days to his pension. He was sipping a lukewarm coffee and typing a report when the heavy doors swung open. "What do we got, Tate?" Sergeant Corbin asked without looking up from his screen. "Got a live one, Sarge," Harlan said proudly, pushing Elena forward until she stood directly in front of the high desk. "Caught her casing a property over on Oakwood. Refused to ID, got combative. Brought her in for booking." Corbin sighed, hitting save on his report. He pushed his glasses up his nose and finally looked over the top of the desk to inspect the suspect. Corbin's eyes drifted over the gray sweatpants, the navy hoodie, and then finally moved up to the face. The silence that fell over the precinct was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating silence, the kind that precedes a catastrophic detonation. Sergeant Corbin's hand, still holding his coffee cup, began to tremble. A drop of dark liquid splashed onto his uniform shirt, but he did not notice. His face drained of all color, fading to an ashen, sickly white. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "Refused to give me her name," Harlan continued, completely oblivious to the sergeant's utter paralysis. "I'm guessing she's got warrants. I'll take her back to the live scan and fingerprint her." "Shut up," Corbin whispered. "Excuse me, Sarge. I said shut your mouth, Tate," Corbin said, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute terror and rising fury. He slowly stood up from his desk. He did not look at Harlan. His wide, terrified eyes were locked entirely on the woman in the handcuffs. Corbin had been in the front row of the municipal auditorium not long ago. He had watched as the city's new chief of police was sworn in, and he remembered perfectly well the woman in the black robes who had administered the oath. "Tate," Corbin said, his voice barely more than a ragged breath. "Take those handcuffs off her. Sarge, she's uncooperative." "Take the goddamn handcuffs off her right now!" Corbin roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the precinct with such ferocity that two other officers poked their heads out of the break room down the hall. Harlan blinked, stunned by the outburst. Confused, he reached for his keys, stepped behind Elena, and unlocked the cuffs. Elena brought her arms forward slowly, rubbing her bruised wrists. She did not look at Harlan. She looked directly up at Sergeant Corbin. Her gaze was terrifyingly calm. "Good evening, Sergeant Corbin," Elena said smoothly. Good evening, Your Honor," Corbin stammered, frantically coming around the side of the desk. I am so profoundly sorry. Are you hurt?" Harlan froze. The keys slipped from his fingers and hit the linoleum floor with a sharp clatter. The blood rushed out of his head, leaving a loud ringing sound in his ears. Your Honor," Harlan repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Elena slowly turned to face the officer who had just assaulted her. The faded hoodie suddenly seemed to carry the weight of a judicial robe. "My name," she said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room, "is Elena Whitaker. I am a United States District Judge. And, Officer Tate, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about the Fourth Amendment." The silence in the police department booking room was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Officer Harlan Tate stood frozen, staring at the discarded handcuffs, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The metallic clatter still echoed in his mind, drowning out the frantic buzzing of the overhead fixtures. Sergeant Lyle Corbin, a man who had seen riots and homicides without flinching, was physically shaking. He grasped the edge of the booking desk, his knuckles stark white, staring at the woman in the gray sweatpants. Judge Elena Whitaker did not raise her voice. She did not yell, scream, or demand immediate executions, which somehow made her presence infinitely more terrifying. She carefully rubbed her wrists, noting the deep red indentations left by the cold steel. Her dark eyes swept the room, taking a meticulous mental inventory of the space, the offices, and the positioning of the security cameras in the corners of the ceiling. "Sergeant Corbin," Elena said, her tone cool and measured, "I require my personal belongings immediately. Furthermore, I am issuing a verbal demand for the immediate preservation of all digital and physical evidence related to this encounter. This includes Officer Tate's body-worn camera footage, his cruiser's dashcam video, the GPS tracking data from his vehicle, dispatch audio logs, and the surveillance footage from this room." Corbin swallowed hard, nodding frantically. "Yes, Your Honor. Immediately. Consider it done." He turned his glare toward Tate, a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Tate, belt, badge, gun, now." Tate blinked, snapping out of his catatonic state. "Sarge, wait a minute. You can't do this. I followed protocol." She was combative. She refused a lawful order to identify herself in a high-crime area. "Somerset Hills is not a high-crime area, Officer Tate," Elena interrupted, her voice slicing through his desperate defense like a scalpel. "It is a residential suburb with a crime rate statistically hovering near zero. Furthermore, there is no stop and identify statute in this state that applies to a citizen standing on their own private property without reasonable suspicion of a crime. You had no probable cause. You trespassed, you battered me, and you unlawfully deprived me of my liberty." She was reaching for something, Tate blurted out. A desperate, reflexive lie born of years of covering up bad stops. He pointed a trembling finger at Elena. When I approached, she made a sudden movement toward her waist. Elena looked down at her faded navy hoodie and baggy gray sweatpants. I am wearing sweatpants that do not possess pockets. As for my hoodie, the front pouch is visibly empty. If you are going to fabricate a post-incident justification to cover your constitutional violations, I suggest you coordinate your lies with the video evidence. Assuming, of course, you haven't already attempted to turn your camera off. Tate's face went completely pale. He had, in fact, tapped the mute button on his body camera halfway down the driveway, a habit he had formed to keep his verbal abuse off the record. "Get your gear on the desk, Tate," Corbin barked, stepping around the wooden barrier. "You are relieved of duty pending an internal investigation. Go sit in the break room. Do not touch your phone. Do not speak to anyone." As Tate numbly unclipped his duty belt, the heavy glass doors of the precinct hissed open. Chief Everett Lang strode into the lobby. He was a tall, distinguished man, dressed impeccably. He had been pulled away from an evening event by a frantic, breathless phone call from Corbin. Lang took one look at Elena, recognized her instantly, and stopped dead in his tracks. "Judge Whitaker," Lang breathed, rushing forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of deep apology. "I cannot express how profoundly sorry I am. This is an unmitigated disaster. Please, come into my office. Let us get you some water, maybe a medic to look at your wrists. We will handle this immediately and internally. I promise you, this officer will be severely disciplined." Elena did not take his outstretched hand. She looked at the chief of police with a gaze so piercing, it made him involuntarily step back. "Chief Lang," Elena said smoothly, "I do not want water. I do not want to sit in your office, and we will most certainly not be handling this internally. What occurred tonight was not a breach of departmental policy. It was a violation of federal law under Title 42, Section 1983. Your officer committed false arrest, false imprisonment, and battery." Lang visibly deflated, his evening attire suddenly looking too large for him. "Your Honor, please, we can make this right without dragging the department through the mud. A public scandal will destroy the community's trust in us." "The community's trust was destroyed the moment you allowed an officer with a documented history of excessive force to patrol these streets," Elena replied. "Do not treat me like a fool, Everett. I know who Harlan Tate is. I know about the civil settlement the city paid out years earlier to quietly sweep his downtown assault under the rug. You transferred a liability to a wealthy zip code, hoping his aggression would go unnoticed here. You were wrong." Lang's eyes widened. She knew the city had tried to bury that settlement behind ironclad non-disclosure agreements, but a federal judge with her ear to the legal ground knew everything. "I'm leaving now," Elena announced, turning toward the door. "My legal counsel will contact the city attorney in the morning. Secure the footage, Chief, because if a single frame of video goes missing, I will personally see to it that the Department of Justice opens a pattern or practice investigation into this entire precinct." With that, Judge Elena Whitaker pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked out into the cool night air, leaving a shattered police department in her wake. The following morning, the sun rose over the city, casting a golden light over the municipal buildings. But inside the mayor's office, the atmosphere was dark, frantic, and suffocating. Mayor Donovan Pierce paced behind his massive oak desk, a half-empty cup of antacid resting near his phone. He was a man who survived on public image and quiet negotiations, but the hurricane that had just made landfall on his desk could not be managed with a PR spin. Sitting across from him was Victoria Lang, the city attorney. She looked exhausted, having spent the entire night reviewing the precinct's camera footage and reading the horrifyingly inept incident report filed by Officer Tate before he was suspended. "Tell me this is a nightmare, Victoria," Mayor Pierce pleaded, running a hand through his thinning silver hair. "Tell me my police department didn't tackle and handcuff the most terrifying federal judge in the district over a cardboard box." Victoria adjusted her glasses and opened a thick manila folder. "It is not a nightmare, Donovan. It is a fully documented reality. I have reviewed the dashcam and body cam footage. It is indefensible. Tate initiated contact without reasonable suspicion. He escalated immediately. He used physical force on a non-resistant, unarmed citizen on her own private property. And to make matters worse, she specifically warned him he was violating her constitutional rights, and he mocked her. "Good God," Pierce groaned, sinking into his leather chair. Did he at least leave his camera on? He muted the audio halfway through the encounter. Victoria said grimly, "Which is a blatant violation of department policy and will be construed by any jury as an intentional spoliation of evidence to cover his tracks. But the dashcam audio caught most of it anyway. He called her you people, Donovan. On tape, the racial profiling element is undeniable." The intercom on the mayor's desk buzzed sharply. "Sir," his assistant's voice crackled. "Robert Carmichael is holding on line 1 for Ms. Lang. He says he is representing Judge Whitaker." Pierce and Lang exchanged a look of pure dread. Robert Carmichael was not just an attorney. He was an apex predator in the realm of civil rights litigation. He was famous for dismantling police unions and bankrupting municipalities that tolerated rogue cops. Victoria pressed the speaker button. "This is Victoria Lang." "Victoria, good morning." Carmichael's deep, resonant voice filled the office. He sounded entirely too cheerful, which was terrifying. "I assume you have had a chance to review the cinematic masterpiece your department produced last night." "We are reviewing the incident, Robert," Victoria said carefully, maintaining her professional guard. "The mayor and the chief of police are taking this matter extremely seriously. Officer Tate has already been suspended without pay." "Suspended?" Carmichael chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "How quaint. Let us skip the procedural dance, Victoria. We both know you are holding a losing hand. I have a draft of a federal civil rights complaint sitting on my desk. It names Officer Tate, Chief Lang, and the city. It alleges violations of the 4th and 14th Amendments, battery, false arrest, and negligent retention. We have the dashcam. We have the neighbor, Elias Boone, who witnessed the entire unprovoked assault from his porch." Pierce leaned forward, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Carmichael, this is Mayor Pierce. We want to make this right. We are prepared to offer a substantial settlement today. Completely off the books. No media, no public spectacle. We can authorize a quiet payout from the Risk Management Fund." "Mr. Mayor," Carmichael replied, his tone hardening into cold steel, "my client is a sitting federal judge. She does not need your money. She makes more than enough. This is not about a quiet payout. This is about accountability. You harbored a violent officer. You knew about Tate's previous settlement years earlier. You hid him in an affluent neighborhood hoping the rich folks wouldn't notice, but he picked the wrong driveway." "What do you want, Robert?" Victoria asked, cutting to the chase. $750,000, Carmichael stated. The number dropped into the room like an anvil. $750,000, Pierce gasped, for a minor wrist contusion and an hour in a holding cell. That's extortion. It is a deterrent, Carmichael corrected sharply, and it is non-negotiable. Furthermore, the settlement will be entirely public. No non-disclosure agreements, no confidentiality clauses. The city will issue a formal public apology. Officer Tate will be immediately terminated, and the city will formally request the state's peace officer, Standards and Training Commission to revoke his law enforcement certification. He will never wear a badge again in this state. Lastly, the city will allocate an additional $2 million over the next several years to fund independent third-party de-escalation and constitutional rights training for every officer in your department. Silence stretched across the mayor's office. It was an impossible list of demands. A public settlement of that magnitude would outrage the taxpayers, humiliate the police department, and likely cost Pierce his re-election. "Robert, We cannot agree to a public admission of guilt of that magnitude, Victoria argued desperately. The police union will strike. The city council will mutiny. Then I suggest you buy a very good suit for trial, Victoria, Carmichael said smoothly. Because if we go to court, Judge Whitaker will take the stand. She will testify under oath about how your officer treated a black woman in her own driveway. We will subpoena Tate's entire disciplinary file. We will drag every single excessive force complaint your department has ever buried into the light of a federal courtroom. I will not just win $750,000 from a jury. I will win $3 million. And I will burn your administration to the ground in the process. There was no bluff in his voice. They knew it. Elena Whitaker was a legal titan. Robert Carmichael was her executioner. Against them, a corrupt cop and a panicked mayor stood absolutely no chance. You have a short time to draft the acceptance, Carmichael concluded. Do not test us, Victoria. Have a wonderful day. The line went dead with a sharp click. Mayor Pierce stared at the flashing red light on his console. He looked at his city attorney, reading the inevitable defeat in her eyes. The house of cards had completely collapsed. A single prejudiced assumption by an aggressive cop had just cost the city $750,000 and exposed a rotting foundation of systemic negligence. Draft the paperwork, Pierce whispered, burying his face in his hands. Give them everything they want. The ink on the preliminary settlement draft was barely dry when the local police union decided to declare war. The union president was a man named Silas Grant, a notoriously combative former detective who viewed any disciplinary action against a police officer as a direct assault on the brotherhood. Grant had built his career on defending the indefensible, aggressively bullying city officials, and manipulating the press to turn rogue cops into misunderstood heroes. When Grant received the frantic phone call from Harlan Tate, detailing the impending termination and the staggering $750,000 public settlement, he saw red. Grant did not care that the victim was a sitting federal judge. In fact, he saw her status as an opportunity. He believed that if he could frame Judge Elena Whitaker as an elitist, out-of-touch political figure who was using her immense judicial power to crush a working-class police officer over a simple misunderstanding, he could rally the public and force the mayor to back down. The next morning, Grant held an impromptu press conference on the steps of the police precinct. He stood before a cluster of local news microphones, his face flushed with righteous indignation, flanked by half a dozen off-duty officers who stood in silent, intimidating solidarity. What we are witnessing today is a gross miscarriage of justice and a chilling example of political overreach. Grant bellowed into the microphones, his voice echoing across the concrete plaza. Officer Harlan Tate is a decorated public servant who was simply doing his job. He was patrolling a neighborhood, investigating suspicious activity in the dark, and prioritizing the safety of the residents. Because the individual involved refused to cooperate and subsequently revealed herself to be a powerful federal judge, Officer Tate is now being railroaded by city officials who are more interested in protecting the political elite than standing behind the men and women in blue. Grant paused, glaring at the cameras to ensure his next words landed with maximum impact. We will not allow Officer Tate to be a sacrificial lamb to appease a bruised judicial ego. We demand a full, independent, and transparent investigation, and we demand that Mayor Pierce halt any backdoor settlements designed to bypass due process. The local news stations ran with the soundbite immediately. By midday, the narrative had begun to fracture. Right-leaning talk radio hosts and anonymous internet forums seized upon Grant's narrative, painting Judge Whitaker as a tyrannical jurist who demanded special treatment and punished a cop for daring to ask for her identification. The City Hall switchboard lit up with angry phone calls from residents demanding to know why taxpayer dollars were being handed over to a wealthy judge who could not be bothered to show her driver's license. Mayor Donovan Pierce sat in his office watching the news coverage, with a sinking feeling of absolute dread. The Union's aggressive counterattack was exactly what he had feared. The political waters were becoming hopelessly muddied, and the public was turning against the settlement. But Silas Grant had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed that Judge Elena Whitaker would retreat behind the traditional dignified silence expected of the federal judiciary. He assumed she would refuse to engage in a public mudslinging contest, allowing the Union to control the narrative by default. He was wrong. Elena Whitaker had absolutely no intention of playing the victim, nor would she allow a corrupt Union boss to rewrite the facts of her assault. That afternoon, Robert Carmichael, Elena's attorney, did not issue a press release. He did not hold a press conference to argue with Grant. Instead, Carmichael simply bypassed the media entirely and uploaded an unedited high-definition video file directly to a public cloud server, subsequently emailing the download link to every major national news outlet, legal blog, and civil rights organization in the country. It was the raw, unredacted dashcam footage from Officer Tate's cruiser. Within minutes, the video was playing on continuous loops across national television networks. It bypassed local politics and went straight into the bloodstream of the national consciousness. The public watched in stunned silence as the cruiser pulled up to the driveway. They saw the wealthy, manicured backdrop. They saw a woman in sweatpants, wrestling with a cardboard box. And then they heard the audio. They heard the immediate, unwarranted aggression in Tate's voice. They watched as the officer escalated a completely peaceful situation into a violent confrontation in less than a minute. The pivotal moment of the video, the twist that completely eviscerated Grant's carefully crafted narrative, was the moment Tate commanded Elena to provide her ID. The camera clearly captured Elena's calm, textbook recitation of her Fourth Amendment rights. She did not scream. She did not threaten. She simply articulated the law with the precision of a seasoned jurist. And the public watched, horrified, as Tate sneered, lunged forward, slammed a 54-year-old woman against the trunk of a car, and forcefully twisted her arms behind her back. The audio captured the painful click of the handcuffs. It captured Tate's taunting remark in the cruiser. "You people always have to make it difficult. Always have to push back." The footage was absolute, irrefutable poison to the Union's defense. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a proactive patrol. It was a textbook, undeniable display of racial profiling, constitutional violation, and excessive force. The backlash was instantaneous and devastating. The local news stations that had amplified Grant's defense hours earlier immediately pivoted, bringing on legal analysts who uniformly condemned Tate's actions as blatantly illegal and dangerously incompetent. National civil rights leaders called for a federal investigation into the police department. The story was no longer about a local dispute. It was a national scandal regarding police brutality and systemic racism, perfectly encapsulated in a single undeniable video. Silas Grant's phone stopped ringing. The politicians who usually courted his favor suddenly stopped returning his calls. The off-duty officers who had stood behind him at the press conference quietly scattered, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Inside the precinct, Harlan Tate sat in the break room, staring blankly at the television screen, mounted on the wall, as his own dashcam footage played on national news. The blood drained from his face. He watched his own actions, stripped of his internal justifications and biases, broadcast to the world. He realized, with a sudden crushing finality, that his career was not just over. His entire life was about to be dismantled. The Union, recognizing that Tate was now entirely indefensible and a massive liability to the rest of the force, cut him loose immediately. Grant issued a terse two-sentence written statement, walking back his previous defense, claiming the Union had not been privy to the full context of the video, and stating that the lodge respected the legal process. Tate was entirely alone. Days later, the city council convened an emergency closed-door session. There was no debate. There were no arguments about budget constraints or municipal liability limits. Mayor Pierce sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, looking years older than he had a week earlier. Victoria Lang, the city attorney, laid the finalized settlement agreement before the council members. The terms were exactly as Robert Carmichael had demanded. The city would pay $750,000 to Judge Elena Whitaker. The city would issue a formal, unreserved public apology, admitting complete fault and acknowledging the constitutional violations committed by their officer. The city committed an additional $2 million to comprehensive, independent oversight and training. And most importantly, Officer Harlan Tate was officially terminated, effective immediately, with the city formally petitioning the state board to permanently revoke his law enforcement certification. The council members signed the authorization in grim silence. The following morning, a certified municipal check for $750,000 was delivered via armed courier to the downtown law offices of Robert Carmichael. Carmichael immediately called his client. Elena was sitting in her chambers, wrapped in her judicial robes, preparing for the morning docket. When Carmichael informed her that the funds had cleared, she did not smile. She felt no sense of victory, only a profound, lingering exhaustion regarding the state of the justice system she had dedicated her life to upholding. "Transfer the entire amount," Elena instructed calmly, staring at the framed copy of the Constitution hanging on her office wall. "To which account, Your Honor?" Carmichael asked. "Do not send it to my personal accounts, Robert. I do not want a single dime of that money. I want you to divide it equally between the Equal Justice Initiative and the National Police Accountability Project. Furthermore, I want the donation made publicly, and I want it established as a specialized grant." "Under what name?" Elena's eyes hardened. "Name it the Somerset Hills Fourth Amendment Defense Fund. I want the city leadership to see that name every single time an auditor reviews their municipal tax records. I want them to be permanently reminded of exactly what happens when they allow constitutional rights to be treated as optional suggestions." Carmichael smiled, a deep, genuine expression of respect. "Consider it done, Judge." Across town, Harlan Tate was cleaning out his locker. The precinct locker room was entirely deserted. His former colleagues had purposefully altered their schedules to avoid being in the same room as him. He packed his civilian clothes, his coffee mug, and a few personal photographs into a cardboard box. He left his badge, his service weapon, and his brass nameplate resting on the cold metal bench. Sergeant Lyle Corbin stood by the door, acting as his escort. Corbin's face was an unreadable mask of stoic professionalism. Tate picked up the box. He looked at Corbin, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Many years, Sarge. Many years on the job, putting my life on the line. And it's all gone because of one stop." Corbin did not flinch. He did not offer a shred of sympathy. "It wasn't a stop, Tate. It was an assault. You didn't lose your badge because she was a judge. You lost your badge because you forgot what the badge stands for. Walk out." Tate swallowed hard, the reality of his disgrace finally settling into his bones. He walked out of the precinct through the back door, stepping into the glaring afternoon sun. He had no pension. He had no certification. He had a pending federal civil rights investigation looming over his head. He walked to his personal vehicle, placed his box in the trunk, and drove away, entirely forgotten by the institution he had hidden behind for years. At the appointed hour, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the packed gallery. "The United States District Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Elena Whitaker presiding." The courtroom was filled with attorneys, defendants, and a row of police officers waiting to testify in a massive federal narcotics conspiracy case. As Elena walked up the steps and took her seat behind the elevated mahogany bench, a palpable hush fell over the room. Everyone in the building had seen the video. Everyone knew exactly what she had endured just days prior. The police officers in the gallery sat a little straighter. Their expressions were a mixture of deep respect and unmistakable apprehension. They were acutely aware that the woman looking down at them from the bench was not merely a legal scholar. She was a survivor of the very worst elements of their own profession, a living embodiment of the absolute necessity of the rule of law. Elena arranged her files carefully on the desk. She looked out over the courtroom, her dark eyes analytical, piercing and unwavering. The bruising on her wrists was hidden beneath the heavy black sleeves of her robe, but the memory of the cold steel remained perfectly intact. She would carry it with her for the rest of her career, not as a burden but as a razor-sharp reminder of the immense responsibility she held. "Please be seated," Elena said, her voice dropping into its familiar commanding tone. She picked up her gavel. "Counsel, call your first witness." The gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack. It was the sound of justice, unbroken and entirely unyielding. The $750,000 settlement was ultimately paid, not to Judge Whitaker, but to the organizations fighting the very systemic abuses she endured. Elena returned to the bench, her resolve hardened, serving as a powerful reminder that the law applies to everyone, especially those wearing a badge. Harlan Tate lost his career, a casualty of his own unchecked prejudice and absolute disregard for the Constitution. If this story of justice, accountability, and the fight for civil rights resonated with you, please hit the like button, share this video to spread awareness, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, real-life legal dramas.